Good afternoon, everyone. I always laugh when I see NL aside of my name, considering I'm originally from the United States and I now live in Asia, but thank you for still considering me kind of European. Okay, it's Command L and no, it's not. Yes. So, as I stated, or as was, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be back in Basel. I used to come here a lot. We were doing a project here a number of years ago when I was at a previous office. It's nice to be a part of Future Architecture Platform. Very nice to be here, thanks to the museum, so thank you to the staff and everyone. So, I'll start out talking a bit about my background, and I'll come back around to why that's relevant, at least for me. So that's actually an image of where I'm from, somewhere in there. Not that it matters, is the town that I grew up in very rural Ohio in the United States. And now I live in the Pearl River Delta, kind of halfway between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, which some have said is maybe the biggest city or metropolitan area in the world right now, with economy roughly the size of Korea, on the space roughly the size of the Netherlands, with a population roughly the size of France. But in the past, because we're talking about this maybe differing ideas of architecture, I did fairly standard practice, from master planning things in the States, designed some kind of office buildings when I was in India. The most interesting project ever I did was doing an elephant village when I was working in India. But then, in reference to the Future Architecture Platform, I was one of the hundreds of people who won Europan at one point, and it's still a rendering, like most Europan kind of winners. So that was an excuse to start our office. And like most young offices, we didn't have much work to build, especially since Europan didn't get built, of course. So we started, we made movies, we did installations, but what really got us moving is when we shifted out of the normal way that maybe young practices operate, and we started to push at the edges. And so we started to get involved in how material making was involved with a project we did in Africa. Also further on that, we started looking at bigger systems. So the systems behind architecture became what was interesting for us. So in this case, we looked at funding models for social housing and slums in Cape Town. And then in the Netherlands, with some research we were doing in Eindhoven, we started looking at infrastructural realities and systems. And then we started to look at actually how some of the new technologies that are emerging are really shifting the notion of what infrastructure is and how it will be going forward. And in some ways, this is what got us to China. We were invited, that was about 3 years ago, to be a part of the Shenzhen Biennale and be a part of a new educational platform, which we called the A-Formal Academy. But before I dive into that too much, I mean, my partner, I say we because it's not just me. I'm standing here. I have a partner, Merva Badir, who is not here. She is back in Hong Kong. But just to give a bit of context of what we wanted to be aware of shifting there is, yeah, this circle says a lot for me. There's more people that live in that circle than outside of it. And that circle contains some of the fastest, rapidly developing economies in the world. So there's a lot of pressing changes. And then relating to the profession of architecture, and I think a lot of Westerners look at this graphic and think, yeah, China's crazy, which might be correct. But if you can't read it, all that's saying is, yeah, the number of architects per inhabitant of a country. At the bottom is Italy. Roughly for every one architect, there's 400 people. In China, for every one architect, there's 40,000 people. For us, this didn't mean, oh, China's got a really warped idea of architecture. It meant they're practicing it in a very different way than maybe a European idea of what is architecture. And this intrigued us. How are architects behaving? How are these cities happening? And then we started to want to look at being in a place like Shenzhen. If you know something about it, most people will say if you have any smartphone, 80%, if not 100% of it was made in Shenzhen. So it's a city that's known for making things, and still a very productive society in a massive way. Factories are there. So they make everything in Shenzhen, from cheap plastic to fabric to iPhones to everything there. So we wanted to dig into this and start to understand the systems behind the logistics, the monetary funding, and these kind of how was this city made, not in terms of an urban planning way or an architectural way, but how was it justified in terms of economy and that sort of systems. So starting to understand the way things are made and how it relates to the city, we realized that we as architects were not capable enough to understand this. We needed to partner with differing people. So we started to partner with some of the tech industry. This is David Lee here, who's a contemporary technology anthropologist, I guess you'd say. And we started to look at some of these transforming industrial areas, because in Shenzhen industrial areas, which is appropriate to talk about in a space like this, the transformation is happening really fast, and if you want to say gentrification, that's starting to happen. So we wanted to take action in some of these industrial areas and start to see if we could advocate for, let's say, a slow change instead of a rapid change like you see mostly in China. And what we started to point out to the Shenzhen government, because in Shenzhen there's a big hype of maker spaces, like I think there much is here in Western Europe, is actually a lot of the industrial neighborhoods in Shenzhen are basically maker communities. They have, which is in this handmade map here, they have laser cutters, they have CNC machines, they have 3D printers, they're just spread around the neighborhood. So what if instead of knocking down the neighborhood and putting up kind of a high-tech hub with maker spaces, what if we thought of the community itself as actually already having the pieces of a maker space and starting to fill in other elements? And with that, we wanted to kind of advocate with the community. To be honest, our trick to try and get the attention of the government was partner with European institutions to come over and bring European artists to kind of act in the area and start to illustrate why, through the eyes of a foreigner, why these industrial neighborhoods that maybe the city wanted to get rid of were quite attractive. And for them, they pointed out that the beauty of this kind of proximity to making, which I think is very well known to people here, is you're able to have a much more developed design kind of conversation. If you can actually talk to the men and women who are working in the factory, you can develop a new way of designing and thinking. And the artists we invited from London talked about this in terms of a chair sort of idea. They thought of the chair as actually having, let's say, a framework and could be a much more adaptable thing. So instead of designing a final idea of a chair, they could set up a system for how one could compose their own chair. And we started to extrapolate this idea of how it relates to the neighborhood, how the industrial community could shift and change through small-scale interventions that could be made locally, and in general just wanted to, because architecture in China does tend to be a large-scale process, we tried to work at a smaller-scale process and really work with the local craftsman community and start to really make things and interventions that would allow sort of a contradiction or a moment to reflect on what's going on in this rapidly evolving city. And we made a book about it. But now I'll shift more to the notion of the rural, because this is all just a background for what I'm more interested in talking about is how this relates to the rural. And for that, I want to talk about, one, I don't like this kind of, even though I use the phrase myself, this dichotomy of kind of urban is there and rural is there. Maybe that was true in the past when cities had walls around them and it was mostly farmers on the outside and kind of city dwellers inside. But in contemporary cities, that seems like really a false assumption. And we're not the first people to say this. But it's something I like to call Constellation Urbanism. If you look at, this is Beijing here and Tianjin there, when you start to see the reality of the dotted kind of rural supposed countryside that exists in between, you realize that these cities and countryside are not necessarily so separated. They're actually quite connected and intertwined. It's not the dichotomy that used to exist before. You can see similar realities in India, here between Delhi and Calcutta, but also you can see a similar reality in where we are right now. If you talk about the big blue banana, as some like to say, between London and Milan, and including Switzerland in between, it's much the way things work here. Now, the cities aren't as large as they are in a place like China, but it is this notion of constellation. A lot of the countryside is actually very connected to the urban reality, and reality literally feeds off of each other. So when we thought about the problems facing China, we wanted to be aware of this as a potential. And I think if you cast forward, which I'll do more at the end of the presentation, as you see China talking more and more about its expansive ideas related to infrastructure, you can think about these ideas at an even larger scale when you look at their agenda with the Belt Road Initiative, but that's maybe another topic. So then we wanted to dive into really looking at the rural and its reality in China. And one thing very special that is going on there is what has been dubbed Taobao villages. Taobao is China's version of eBay, let's say, but it's a lot more powerful. Basically, you can buy everything on Taobao, and most people do, so it's a very successful online shopping tool, a bit like Amazon, I guess would be a more appropriate comparison. But Taobao villages, what they really are, to put really simply, is maybe some young man or woman was living in the city, decided to go back home to his rural background, and got back to that rural place, realized that a lot of production had been happening in the city, looked around the countryside to maybe the older generation, saw a lot of men and women that were good at making things with their hands, but maybe didn't have much to do. So they started making things with some of the community there and then putting them online. And if they first just tried to sell 10 and they sold them, then they'd make 100, and then they'd make 1,000, and then they'd make 10,000. If they didn't sell the first 10, they'd stop. But essentially, this Taobao villages, in a few examples, has really transformed a few thousand Chinese rural areas, because essentially they've become kind of like rural factories. They're really making things and using the logistical infrastructure to sell to a lot of the urban dwellers. And has allowed a lot of economy to come into the rural space, and has really started to transform how one thinks about the role of the rural, which is bigger discussion we can get into, but I'll only glaze over the other potentials as it relates to data and things like that. But it's certainly, for one, you can just think about the rural, as we all talk about how the cities are getting really expensive. I think there's not enough people saying that the rural is really cheap. And so you see, whether it's data centers or these things starting to, let's say, invade the rural, and the potential of the rural to come about actually just because it's a cheap place to operate. But so we were aware of the Taobao villages, then we wanted to kind of do some research into how these really happen, because it's not necessarily, a lot of things in China are very top-down, to put it quite politely, but what happens in the rural is a lot more layered. So we looked at, let's say, pretty standard planning sort of analysis in terms of demographics, the buildings themselves, the infrastructure. We did a kind of social, speaking to the people and understanding their needs, realities, and histories. But also what we tried to do was map the economic realities of what was going on in these villages. Because the funding was often coming in a lot of different directions. A lot of it was maybe from wealthy men and women who used to live there who were feeding money back in. There were some of these examples of Taobao villages. There's definitely government money being funded in a lot, especially with the Prime Minister of Xi has got a big goal to feed the rural. But it led to very complex economic models in terms of how the case studies were happening and how they were changing. But in almost all cases, besides tourism, which is always a successful way to improve the rural, a lot of them, they almost always involved connectivity and technology. So with that, we kind of wanted to take a step forward. And yeah, the name of our office is LCC, and by the way, I'll point out compositions in terms of the previous discussion of the notion of whether a thing is designed or not designed new. We certainly picked the word composition consciously. And we got a client after this research that was interested in the rural in this area called Ningde. You probably think you haven't heard of Ningde, and I would understand. It's in the Fujian province in China, which is basically just between Hong Kong and Shanghai and along the coast. But you may have actually seen it in social media. It's been getting some attention. Just for FYI, if you've ever seen something go by on social media that says the floating villages of China, more than likely it's actually talking about Ningde and some of the examples of what's going on in the bay just outside this city area. But our site is actually not in the bay. Some of the floating villages I mentioned are more in the southern area. It's in the valleys. And so the client is a very different client, I'll say, because the client was given the land because you can see the valley situation. It's a very flat valley with a very, to even say river is a bit of a, giving it a bit of a compliment, but a very small river and a few series of historic villages that sit very naturally against the hills that frame this valley. So you can see in some of the images, it's in some ways a very typical, nice, rural Chinese setting, but maybe not so historic, so the notion of tourism has not come in yet. But what's interesting about the client is that it really is truly a tech client, much like Facebook or Google. Actually, all they want is data. They are growing food, that is their medium, let's say. But in reality, the actual selling of the food is not how they will make their money in terms of their business model. Their business model is they've developed high-end satellite imagery, which they can have on satellites, drones, or inside greenhouses, which I'll talk about in a bit. And they measure how the plants are growing in the soil, and they collect the data, and in the end, they will sell the data. That's actually their business model, which as an architect is an unusual client, because we like to joke that the clients don't care what things look like or don't have any idea, but this client really doesn't have to care in terms of the business model. What it looks like does not matter. They just need the data. So in some ways, it's really freeing or paralyzing as an architect of what do you do when at least hypothetically the client doesn't care. So we played around with different ideas. We could design everything from how it looked like from above and these sort of questions. But getting back into it a bit more, so the client wants to do very high-tech greenhouses, and they have the ability to do so. But I lived in the Netherlands. I know what kind of these industrial greenhouses are and what they've done to the Dutch countryside. In some ways, you can find it really beautiful, how the Dutch countryside looks west of Rotterdam and in some other parts. But in many ways, they're just glass factories. So any sense of what the rural is in terms of a qualitative idea is, let's at least politely say, has vastly changed. So we immediately started talking to the client about, well, come on, you want to respect the rural quality here. And by the way, the client is actually a decent human being, in case it sounds like when I say he doesn't care, of course he does care. But we immediately started talking about the value of some of the existing spaces, smaller spaces and things like this, because they do want people to visit this kind of technology food center that they have. And in a very simple way, all we said is, well, don't do huge greenhouses, even though they're more economical. Make smaller spaces and have them relate to this traditional Chinese character. And so for us, this is kind of going to frame the ongoing thing I'll bring up here in terms of design is, how do you juggle this desire to not hide this technological or new sort of space that you're inherently creating, but also want to have some sort of reference to the spatial quality of the past? Now this is debatable. You can say we're being romantic in terms of our ideas, but it's certainly for us an important qualitative question to have going forward is how do we find a balance of what is rural versus this notion of technology. And so this sort of framed these initial spaces we showed and some initial images to get an idea to the client of how this could be a greenhouse sort of space, but also still in some way reference some of the past that had existed in the area. But then further than that, the client does want some residential there as well as some office space, which I'll come back to for his team. But the building quality in the area is something we were really excited about. The Fujian province is very rich in terms of agriculture, but also in terms of building materials. They regularly build out of mud, stone, concrete, bamboo, wood. There's a really diverse array of building materials very commonly used in the villages and kind of mixed, so the buildings can be quite eclectic, which we find very beautiful. It's not so pure like other Chinese contexts that maybe use one material. So we wanted to talk about not having people live and work over there and the greenhouses over there, but how we could put them together. And again, we're not the first ones to do this. Again, this goes to some of the previous discussions on this notion of copying. We certainly wanted to learn from some examples. And one of our favorite was in, I can never remember if it's Sweden or Norway, but one of the Nordic countries, what they have, I believe you would pronounce nature house. But generally the idea that you can basically put the house inside of the greenhouse and take advantage of the heating you naturally get from a greenhouse and some of the air quality, and you can still ventilate and handle things well so the house is actually in the greenhouse. So we started talking to the client about this and the potential of how we could represent some of the materiality that's available, in this case illustrated in bamboo, of a house that would kind of sit floating above within the greenhouse and allow still growing to happen on the lower level. Now moving to the office buildings, the client wanted a pretty, because he is truly a tech client, they do want something, quote, high tech. They do want a showcase, they do want to look innovative, let's say. So they start thinking of spaces like this. They do want it to, let's say, look like a greenhouse. But again, we wanted to talk to them about can this, even maybe a 4 or 5 story office building kind of relate to the spatial quality that exists. Maybe it's a bit referential, but was something we wanted to explore. And so, talking about mixing nature and high tech, there's certainly examples that probably most of us know where these images come from. But we start to play with the idea of what is a greenhouse and what is an office, and how we can kind of come up with something a bit new to play around with this notion of representation. So not looking purely like a greenhouse, you could also say it looks like a bit of 70s architecture, and to be a bit playful with this notion in regards to the client. But these are architectural issues. Then we also had the landscape itself. Again, if let's say, quote, robots are taking care of the fields, it also doesn't require a planting strategy that maybe we've always assumed before when man is doing it, which usually kind of pushes things to be in very linear sort of systems. I think of the Dutch tulips as the thing we always talked about with the client, as an example of a touristic, sort of visually pleasing thing that is actually a very efficient sort of planting strategy. But we thought we could push it further. How can we think of these planted areas as something more? Because, yeah, the robots, in theory, you can plant whatever you want. And so we started to find references. This is actually one from Japan, simply done with rice, where they started to just treat the fields as one big canvas, especially since it can be seen from the air. And so this, poorly drawn for now, because we're heading to the landscape phase of the project, first idea was just simply to treat the field that is in front really just as a mirror of the landscape that's above. And so this is something we're looking to evolve still, but how can we start to think of it almost like a paint by numbers sort of scenario by using the series of plants that make sense to grow there and the client is interested, to kind of fill in to create an image, which could be ever changing. I mean, they replant, they can get 4 seasons in Ningde. So the, quote, painting can change and evolve every time, but this is something we're trying to set up, is to adding a different visual experience because of this reality. But I begin because we're, as architects, are more democratic, are interested in pushing at the edges of the project. We got interested in some other possibilities. And again, in partnership with the tech gentleman I mentioned before, we wanted to take some of the things that are happening in urban China and start to bring them to the rural. So this notion of what we have been dubbed the Fab Village was the idea. In some ways you could say it's kind of a pretty normal notion. Basically, it's the idea of bringing an incubator space to a rural reality and starting to bring innovation and that possibility to a rural setting to allow possibilities for businesses, for the community, and for others. So we've started an engagement with the community, talking to them, seeing what they're interested in, presenting them ideas, even letting them vote on what is their favorite. There's also notions of sustainability, of course. The farming techniques they currently use in the region are certainly not the most non-toxic or not the most sustainable, so these issues certainly come up as a way moving forward. But maybe the biggest, well, not the biggest, but one of the more important changes is how technology can really play a role in the rural and be very, at least theoretically, transformative. And this is what I think is actually the most original idea, and we didn't think about it, that our tech partner did, is in China, because it's so competitive. Many of the students, even if they want to go to school in China, but especially if they want to go to the West, it's extremely competitive for Chinese students to get into the kind of schools they want, whether it's the ETH or Harvard or Tsinghua. So a lot of them really want to kind of up their portfolio when they apply. So they're very hungry for interesting experiences, and their very obsessive parents are very willing to pay money for that. So actually our funding stream for the kind of companies that are coming to this space who want to operate here and be a part of an innovation process is not the usual venture capital model. Actually the money comes through education. So high school students come to the space, their parents pay a decent amount of money. That money actually becomes the base money for the companies to kind of start and do their initial sort of work. As well, the high school students provide, let's say, a base level of labor, and for the high school students, they get a chance to participate in this innovation. So that's an example of how we're pursuing a different funding model to allow opportunities for the rural. And to give an illustration of what this means, and this, my favorite example is, because I grew up in a rural area, if you've ever been around farming equipment and know what it costs to buy most farming equipment, it's extraordinarily expensive. It's usually way more than even a house in a city. But most farms in the world, like 70 or 80%, depending on how you want to count, are really small farms. So it's not realistic for a small farmer to ever buy a tractor. So that means they usually have to do it through manual labor. But actually, through technology and these sort of things, let's say a small-scale tractor can actually be really easily developed now, and is starting to be developed. So you can do this with very simple things with photovoltaic cells, a camera, a bit of a GPS. You can start to have a tractor that starts to manage the farm without sprays and things like this. And that could be very affordable or even makeable by the farmer themselves. So some of the workshops we've been doing on site are on these sort of issues, where students and companies are coming trying to develop this technology together on site. And so, not to go too much more into it, this is now this kind of maker hub or fab village in the space. You can see some of the existing buildings, because Yantou, which is one of the 4 villages that sits within the valley, will be the main hub. Is about 50% vacant, so there's a lot of opportunity for the villagers to, one, maybe rent out some spaces to some of the people who want to come, also potentially in drawing tourists or others they can also rent out. But we think even more so, it allows us in a space that's generally been kind of left behind to also start to invest in some of the community spaces. This is a fairly old performance hall that we're already starting to invest in and improve and starting to have events within. And so we'll build that over a series of years. Okay, and then another idea we're bringing to Ningde now is what I call a be and all. And this is, we're just starting to discuss this with the government, and they've been interested. So let's say we initially got involved as designers, then let's say we got involved, let's say, in the community in terms of more of an economic and business model sort of way, and now in a cultural way. And the term be and all might sound terrible, but it actually started because when I first started to tell the client about the idea, they didn't know how to say biennale, so I said it's like be in all. And then we also, as we started to develop it with the client, we started to realize we were interested in it being much more than a biennale. So we know there's plenty of rural art and cultural events, many lovely examples, including in Asia, that we've used in our discussion. But the idea of this is not, one thing I find quite frustrating about biennales or design weeks is, again, we all kind of sit within our silos. So it's a bunch of architects talking to each other or a bunch of artists talking to each other and things like this. So the idea of the be and all in this case is actually to try and use these series of groups that we're interested in having in the area, business people, tech people, cultural people, maybe fabrication people, as well as artists and architects coming together over 2 years. And so that's the idea that we're building up with the community and hope to launch soon, is an idea of kind of a rural be and all, as we're calling it. And again, spread all over, and this is definitely not original, but spread all over the valley and all over the area. So it's not just about our site and where the client is, but about some of the other interesting areas, including the floating village area, which is here, which as much as I think is beautiful, certainly is eye-catching in terms of photos, the Chinese government is slowly starting to remove some of the houses. So it's definitely a role of advocacy on our part in terms of maybe preserving or allowing this sort of cultural sort of space to continue. Now switching, because when I started reading the call for what this event was about how things were shifting and changing, I thought it was appropriate to talk about a landscape architecture competition we won along with Lola Landscape Architects out of Rotterdam and Taller Architects out of Bogota and Rotterdam. Because in this case, this is on the northern end of Shenzhen. You can see in this slide how it fits into Hong Kong is down here, Shenzhen is here, and it's really at the northern end as part of an entire green structure they have in Shenzhen. And the goal was to actually have a sports and nature park, and very vaguely stated. And we did a few, let's say, basic things. The site is, as you can see on this image, to the east is actually very much a nature site, and to the west will be much more of an urban condition. So in terms of the programming, in many ways, it felt like the east part of the park is extraordinarily different than the west. And we wanted to bond this together, which we did with a red walkway which also takes care of some of the topographical challenges, allowing people who are maybe less physically active the ability to actually walk across the site and not have to walk up hills. And this red path kind of evolves in some spaces to form amphitheaters or other sorts of elements. There's a series of pavilions in the site. And then we also proposed in the east part of the site the notion that in terms of habitation, that we could actually have kind of, let's say, urban camping, that we would actually have a series of pavilions where people could rent in a, let's say, Airbnb style way and actually sleep in the park overnight as a way to activate the east part of the site. And yeah, an alternative lighting idea to deal with some of the power grid that was there. But the reason I wanted to speak about this park was not actually so much about those things I mentioned, but how we approached this notion of evolving, because we started talking immediately between the three offices about how landscape architecture or park design is often really funny. Inherently, landscapes are growing and evolving, so usually landscape architects are very aware that their things will change, very different than architects are. But yet, when parks are designed, they're usually designed much like buildings. You show the initial image, and you assume it'll be like that forever. And through the notion of sport and nature, we thought, can we actually showcase the reality that actually nature and sports do evolve and change? And so the sports one is maybe less naturally understood, but the more we looked at it, the more you realize actually sports or leisure is constantly evolving. Sports that used to be popular 50 years ago are often not popular now. When you think, especially in a reality like Asia, in terms of technology, there's new sports emerging. So could we have a park that actually consciously showcases these new sort of sports, tests them out, and if they, quote, work, we can place them in the park and maybe remove old parts. So we actually proposed an R&D center for sports and a series of kind of test spaces for different sporting with kind of, let's say, funny-looking play spaces and funny groupings. Some more related to tech, some more, let's say, open interpretation of cycling and running. The ball sports is kind of my favorite because the notion of ball becomes very broad. And so we wanted to create this new kind of sports fields to enhance the idea that it's really a place that the basketball court might not be there forever, the football field might not be there forever. But then also in terms of nature, I mean, there's a lot of talk about how nature is changing and advancing, but in terms of how it's come into park design, it hasn't so much. So we also created an R&D center for nature with the idea that we could really test out new sort of natural habitat in the space, and then we could use it as a way to showcase around the site. Because parks are often actually growing trees or whatever plants they want to be in the park off-site in nurseries, and then they bring them onto the park site once they're fully grown. But we wanted to make this kind of loop we have is kind of a looping nursery, so you could actually see the plants that are going to come in the park in a more current reality that will show up later. Okay, and the last thing about this advocacy and about infrastructure, and it's something I'm currently interested in, but is notably a bit abstract, is something I call dispersed infrastructure. I think particularly this relates to the rural, if I'm honest. When we see these new technologies emerging, whether it's photovoltaic cells, even in Africa there's a lot of people exploring ideas of how you can draw water out of the air, self-driving cars, even blockchain if you want to go there. But in a much more simple way, just the reality of phones. I mean, banks are now dispersed in a place like this is a picture taken in Nairobi or rural Kenya. It shifts the way things work. I mean, we really all have kind of infrastructure in our pocket right now. So I have a bit of the infrastructure right here. Now I do need a major corporation to kind of facilitate it, and the government is involved, but it fundamentally changes the role of infrastructure because I kind of own it. So the future of infrastructure, at least in this hypothesis, is really going to be quite different. And this is what we call this notion of autonomous urbanism, which I'm honest is more about the rural. And this is where we start to look at Shenzhen. And we look in the factories there as maybe leading to the future of our cities or maybe our rural. And you start to see how man and machine kind of cohabitate with each other and collaborate with each other. And if you look at some of the factories, this is a particular shipping factory, actually in Shanghai, not in Shenzhen. They actually kind of start to look like cities, except let's say the buildings are moving. And so, and then you know, what does this mean for the future of our cities? In some ways, yeah, I'm being a bit projective, but in a small scale way, you can really look at the impact that just simple high tech related to bikes has transformed Chinese cities. Now, all Chinese cities are littered with bikes everywhere, because simply when you get off the train, you have an app, you can rent a bike, you can take it home, and you can leave it there. So the existing city is really transformed in terms of how people move with this kind of very simple technology, a bike app. And in other ways, coming back to nature, you can look at some nurseries. There's some nurseries now that just use robots to actually move the plants around, which is one of my favorite examples. And there's examples of how we're trying to engage with people who are doing self-driving cars. There's people like Shell Corporation who are getting interested in this dispersed infrastructure. ETH is talking about the reality of this kind of robots in building. But what we're interested in is kind of somewhat suggested in this image, is how we start to cohabitate it and how we as architects can be aware or try and be more aware that this is coming and start to have a conversation with the public of this reality of what this means. So to pick up on something Le Corbusier said, you know, he kind of said that, let's say, the historic city was framed by the ass of the donkey, and then he had this idea of that the streets of the future were for men. But if we think about the streets coming up in the next generation, if they're for us and machines, what would those streets be? The LSE has also very perfectly said that the city has always been shaped by its moving parts. And then I think giving two examples that are more concrete of what I mean by these small-scale technologies and moving parts shaping cities is Shenzhen. That's part of Shenzhen. On the right is 40 years ago, on the left is current. And Shenzhen is the best example of how the idea of the shipping container fundamentally changed the reality for a city. Shenzhen really exists because there's a special economic zone, and they were one of the first people to buy into the idea of the shipping container. So this idea of shipping containers has not just changed Shenzhen, but it's changed the entire global economy. A very simple idea that we can make a standard box that everyone has all over the world and we can move it has changed our global economy and our cities. And in a more Western or American example, a reference I like to use, this is New York with a drawing done roughly 1880, so just before the invention of the car and the elevator. So after the car and the elevator were invented, the role of what New York looks like is completely different now. There's wide highways, there's skyscrapers, cities look completely different. This still looks like kind of what Amsterdam does, because it was New Amsterdam still at that point. So two technologies, very small scale, fundamentally changed the way our cities work. And for us, going forward, when I start to think about the rural, because I really think the reshaping of our cities is maybe not so likely, but when I think about the rural, it actually is quite likely. And the example I like to give there is in Africa and really in China for sure, they're starting to use drones for delivery. So in really tough to get to places, instead of building a road, they just have the drones deliver things. Or in the African context, they're using it more in a humanitarian way, delivering blood, delivering medicine. But if you say they don't need to build roads, if you say there doesn't need to be a power grid because you have a photovoltaic system that's more local, if you can maybe hypothetically get water out of the air, then that means you don't need roads. If you don't need roads, that fundamentally changes the role of the government. That fundamentally changes the idea of how one does urban design in a standard way. It really shifts the discussion. It can make us rethink of what our streets and roads and kind of common and shared spaces could be in these sort of evolving rural habitats. So I think we as architects have to be more aware of the potential of what these infrastructures and technologies are doing in terms of our own practice, but also in terms of engaging a conversation of what this means for society. That's it. Thank you very much.